Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself, as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriel, and we are honored to be joined by Sarah Davis-Secord. Sarah is a professor of history and the associate dean for graduate studies at the University of New Mexico. She's interested in medieval interreligious interactions and long-distance trade in the Middle Ages and has written books on the early medieval Sicily, human migration across the Mediterranean, and a co-authored textbook on the global Middle Ages. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm excited. I love, I've been to Sicily, actually, which is not a common thing. I love the place. There's so much neat medieval stuff there, and I can't wait to get into it, among the various other kind of things that I'm sure we'll talk about.
It's beautiful, and the people are wonderful, and the food is great. I recommend very highly.
Yes, highly recommend. Except, and we can do this, actually, because the listenership is not vast enough that it's going to be overrun by, American tourists after this. But we do recommend it, definitely go to Sicily. Okay. But before we get to Sicily, I do want to, as I'm sure listeners of the show already know, I have to start with my silly question. And it's perhaps silly because it involves time machines. So I beg your indulgence here. This is a special kind of time machine, though. I have to say it is a single use and there and back, so you don't have to stay kind of anywhere that you go to. And there's a caveat on it. It can only be used for one purpose, and that purpose is that you, Sarah, have been presented with this time machine, and you have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself that you will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How does young Sarah react to that news?
I almost assuredly have no clue what this means. Right? This is just, meaningless words to young Sarah. I didn't grow up particularly fascinated with the Middle Ages. I've always liked history. I always liked really old stuff, just whatever it was, old things. But the idea of being a professional medievalist would never, this just wouldn't compute, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't even think about the idea of what would it be to be a historian. Even though I loved old stuff, I'm not sure I understood that as a job. And I didn't grow up around people who were teachers or intellectuals or educated beyond, my family are very highly educated, but nobody who worked in academia, for example. Mm-hmm. So none of this would have made any sense. I probably would have been excited once I told myself what it meant. And of course, amazed at the idea of being able to make a profession out of this, right? Make a job. Sometimes I think about how lucky we are to get to do this really cool stuff and call it a job.
Yeah. People pay us money to do this stuff.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And even when people don't pay us money, there's a certain joy in kind of being able to study something that you find particularly interesting or let alone kind of are passionate about. So I'm curious then, so when did the turn towards the Middle Ages kind of happen? Oftentimes, I've been asking this for all of our guests for the last few months now, since we started the podcast, and it's often one thing. It's not always kind of one thing, but it's like a course or a professor or a book or something like that. Was it similar for you, or was it just kind of
Definitely.
you just kind of found yourself here by some inexplicable circumstances?
Just stumbling into it, right?
I mean,
Yeah, right. For me, it was the language. I was always drawn to the idea of learning Latin. Mm-hmm. It wasn't offered at my high school. And so when I got to college, in amongst the other things that I thought were kind of practical, science and math and things like that, I started taking Latin, and it was just an instant love. And so I kept taking these Latin classes sort of on the down low, right? Thinking I was going to do something else. Before you know it, I'm a classics major.
Okay.
And it kind of snowballed from there where, you take these classes on the ancient world, and classics is, of course, very interdisciplinary. So I'm taking literature classes and history classes and language classes and all those kinds of things. And then eventually you see, there's this time period that's close, right? And so you start to take the medieval courses, and it wasn't really until the end of my college journey that I had one of those moments where a professor just makes all the difference. I ran into my medieval history professor in the hallway. I think I was probably a senior. And he said, "So what are you doing after you graduate?" And I said, "Well, thinking about graduate school, maybe classics, maybe medieval." And he said, No, don't do classics. Be a medievalist." Right?
Yeah,
like it's an amazing moment of like anti-gatekeeping, right? He saw me excited about the Middle Ages and wanted me to do what he does, right? And so it was this just incredible moment. He said, "Come to my office. I will start to teach you some of the skills that you'll need." He started to teach me paleography and things like that, and really get me prepared for thinking about graduate school in medieval. So kind of an accidental conversation, even with a professor who I wasn't convinced that he liked me, right? Like, he was a sort of notoriously tough professor. So I think that is part of what meant all the more to me, was that he's somebody with really high standards. And so from then on, it was taking all the rest of the medieval courses that I could and being grateful for my classics background, because I think it gives me that interdisciplinarity and the focus on the Greek and the Latin that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. It seems that, I mean, that's a relatively common thing, at least in the people that I've talked to, thus far, is that sometimes, if you're not starting in the Middle Ages, you're kind of pulled into it, either by starting kind of earlier and then you kind of drift later, or the opposite, you start a little later and you just kind of keep going backwards to find things, and it's like, oh wow, this medieval stuff is actually kind of pretty important. But I want to highlight too something you said about the attention of a teacher who can kind of really change your life. And I'm thinking about, like, I did my undergraduate at University of Delaware, and I had a similar experience with the medieval historian there, in which he just took us seriously as students, and he wasn't like the nicest professor. He was great, he passed away a few years ago, but like he was great, and like I still kept in touch with him for a long time. But but it was really like he demanded something, and like I just wanted that, right? Like oh, this is a shared enterprise. Like, we're doing something together, and you demand something, but then there's kind of rewards of the shared participation kind of at the end, and that could be really kind of transformative, right?
Exactly. Very transformative. And I don't think that professors have to be cuddly, right, in order to make that kind of impact on students. To say, I have high standards and I see you meeting them. Let's go together. Let's ask new questions together, right? One of the most exciting things I know in the classroom is to learn from our students, right? And to see them teach us something, and to think about that shared intellectual enterprise going all the way back to the origins of myself as a medievalist, and then being able to do that with students now it's exciting. Yeah,
it's a real joy, right, to have that kind of opportunity in the classroom, and then to bring kind of the research that you do kind of outside, because we wear many different hats, as professional medievalists, right, to research, teaching, and then all that other service stuff that we have to do, to keep the university kind of going. It's important. Right. I will absolutely say that.
Yeah. Keep the lights on.
Keep the lights on, absolutely. Yeah. So, but at the same time, to kind of see those moments of bringing together, and like you said, like, I've had experiences too in the classroom where somebody will ask a question and be like, I've never thought of it that way. That is a great question. Yeah. And it's just like, it's not just their light bulbs going off, but it's my light bulbs kind of going off. And that could be incredibly fun. Do you still feel that pull though of the ancient world? Because you do, and we're going to talk about this, you work on the Mediterranean, and so like, and as every kind of, at least medievalist, I want to say every historian, but I know that's not actually true. Like, every medievalist kind of knows, right, is that periodization is kind of a joke, right? Like, it's a thing that we have to deal with, and it makes a certain amount of sense, but like, there are fuzzy boundaries between kind of periods. So do you still feel kind of the tug of classics at you sometimes and want to go back even further in some of your work?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm always going to have that as a kind of intellectual love, right? Like, I'm so excited about the Odyssey movie coming up this summer.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So excited about it, right? Because to me, that is still one of my great joys. And really, not to get too soon to my work on Sicily, but that breaking down of boundaries, that breaking down of periodization, that breaking down of this place is one civilization, or is it a different civilization? Is it in the ancient Roman world? Is it in the what do we call this, right? Early Byzantine, Mediterranean, right? All of these things, they flow so much into each other that I can't think of Sicily, I can't think of the Mediterranean at all as being divorced from its ancient past. At the same time, we all recognize, what I call the Western Civ version of history, which is there are some really big things that change.
Sure.
And they happen in the Mediterranean, and they happen in and around Sicily. So balancing that issue of really big changes that cause something to happen, but the kind of almost slowness of those changes, that maybe we recognize them after hundreds of years after they've happened or started happening, then we see the impact of them.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something so I kind of did the opposite of you, and this is why I brought that up. As I started kind of more like late medieval, early modern, and I just kind of pulled back. And so even when I was doing my PhD, my second field outside of medieval was early modern. So we had to read. This is a long-winded podcasty way of saying like I read a book once and it changed the way I thought about things. Is Brodel's The Mediterranean, right? Which is kind of a famous book about kind of the long sweep of history, the Annals school, if you're familiar with that or something like that. And like every time that I think about the Mediterranean itself and like the places that abut that is just like, I hate you, but like you were onto something, man. Like you really were onto something. So
yeah, really onto something. And I think that it's interesting to think about the lasting power of some of these books and some of these ideas. And not to be romantic about the Mediterranean, but when you read something like Brodel, you get really excited about it as a place, and you can see the placeness of the islands, the shores, the sea. And I think that's something that Mediterranean studies really does have to offer, is the kind of joy of thinking about seas and connections over a very long span of time, which is what the Annal was particularly interested in.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, you brought this up about kind of the placeness of things too, is that I think that seems to have been, I've been doing this kind of for a while now, and it seems like there has been kind of a material turn kind of in history specifically, and art historians will roll their eyes at me, and everybody else will, archaeologists of course, be rolling their eyes at me, but like historians, we're a little slow on the uptake sometimes. I'll be the first to admit. Yeah, a little bit slower. But I think that that's something that not just in the Mediterranean, but across Europe kind of, I think as well, is like understanding the importance of geography, but also the material remains of things. And that's something that, like you were saying, and this is kind of a segue of trying to talk about getting more towards the specifics of kind of your work, is the material remains of Rome, like, don't disappear, right? In ways that they do kind of in Northern Europe, for example, or something like that, that you're always kind of surrounded about that. I mean, you can go to any of these cities now and you see, some of those objects as well. And so those cities have been occupied for a very long time. Right. So as a way of saying that is like, so can you tell us a little bit about kind of medieval Italy, medieval Sicily, and kind of how that became kind of a specific site of interest of yours? And like you were talking too about kind of, it sits outside, which, it does, of course, outside of one civilization or kind of one identity. And like, so how does the history kind of tell us that story?
Yeah. One of the things that's really fascinating about Sicily is its both centrality and its sort of marginalization in the larger story of the Middle Ages. It is the largest island in the Mediterranean, and it sits, if you were to divide the Mediterranean into 4 quadrants, it's almost as though it sits right at the nexus of those two intersecting lines. So Sicily itself is very interestingly placed, right, between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean, between Italy, Europe, right, those northern shores of the Mediterranean, and the southern shores of the Mediterranean, or Africa, right, or for the medieval period, the Islamic world. And so its geographical placement and its importance along shipping routes, trade routes, and ports has made the conversation about Sicily be very, very different than other places in Europe. So it's central, right? It's central in the Mediterranean. It's central to a lot of things that are happening, right? It's the first Roman overseas province. It's essentially what causes the Roman Empire to begin to create provincial structures for governing overseas colonies, right? So it's central to some of these things. And yet, the basic narrative of medieval Sicilian history is so far outside of what most of us are taught, right? What most people think of as the kind of standard narrative of the Middle Ages, right? For example, the post-Roman world, after the so-called decline of the Roman Empire, we end up talking a lot in the survey of European history, or the Western Civ version of history, about decline and economic backwardness and the decline of cities and ruralization, right? All these kind of catchphrases for the early Middle Ages, and almost none of them is true for Sicily. Sicily continues in that late antique and early medieval period to be urbanized, to be broadly connected across the Mediterranean with ships coming in and out. It's still got money at a time when most of Europe is not monetized, and that money is still valuable. It's still traded. It's still accepted. Stuff is still coming in. It goes against the grain of the narrative that we tell about the Middle Ages. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting about it. And the thing that really drew me initially to Sicily, though, is my interest in Muslim-Christian interactions. When I was moving, like I said, towards being a medievalist in college, I took the first half of the Islamic history survey and just loved it. Absolutely fell in love. And so over the next few years, trying to figure out, how do I incorporate this newfound love of the Islamic world with this kind of thing I've been preparing myself for, even if I didn't know it, right? Just to be a medievalist. And eventually, when I started graduate school, took Arabic and started moving towards wanting to do something about the intersections or the relationships between the Muslim world and the Christian world, or Muslims and Christians as people. But because I like to be contrary, as my grandmother put it, I didn't want to do Spain, right? Because I was like, oh, everybody works on Spain who's interested in Muslims and Christians, or Muslim-Christian-Jewish interaction. As it turns out, there was a very good reason why most people work on Spain, and that is huge numbers of sources, which Sicily, I had to fight a little bit harder to find sources to tell the stories about Sicily that I wanted to tell. So it's this kind of combination for me of, it's this place that is seen as mediating between the Islamic world and the Christian world. It's ruled by Muslims for 2 centuries. Then it's conquered as a part of this expansive 11th century Norman movement out of the north of France. It's the same kind of general population who take over England in 1066. They just go to southern Italy a little bit sooner, somewhere around 1016, and then start pushing in 1060, 1061 into Sicily, taking it, quote, back from the Muslims. And so it gives me an opportunity to think about these kind of big picture stories about, how did the Islamic world and the Christian world, both the Greek Christian world and the Latin Christian world, intersect and relate to each other. And it's an opportunity to kind of blow people's minds.
Yeah.
Almost inevitably, if I give a talk, or even in a classroom, give the overview of medieval Sicilian history, people will come to me and say, I had no idea. Or they'll say, I went to Sicily and I had no idea that Muslims ruled the island for 2 centuries, right? Or my mom and dad went on a tour and they were never told this. It's this way of kind of completely changing our story about what the Middle Ages is and what it looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's really important too, I think, is because too often, and for very understandable, even if regrettable, kind of 19th century reasons, right? Like, Islam was written out of European history for a very long time, right? And so the idea, or the necessary way that we can remind people that Islam has been part of Europe, in Sicily, not just in Spain, but in Sicily as well, like in Italy, right? Like, and people don't realize too, where Sicily is, as we were talking about kind of, beforehand, but also like how close it is to the mainland. Like, when you're in Messina, like you can just look out across the water and see, you could just see the mainland. Like, it's just right there. So it's not terribly far away.
And nor is Africa.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like it's just not that far. It's across the Mediterranean. And the other thing too, which you mentioned as well, is about the importance of the Byzantines. right? The Greek Christians as well, which were kind of a persistent presence there. Because I think oftentimes when, and this happens with Crusade historians quite a bit, it's a little bit better now, but it's not as bad now, is they tend to still talk in binaries, Muslim versus Christian. But here it really shows you, Sicily does, right, is that there are three different kind of major factors kind of interacting with one another.
Absolutely. If we're thinking about it at the religio-political kind of sphere or, quote, civilizations, if we're thinking about population groups, there's at least a fourth one, and that is Jews. There's a number of Jewish communities who live in Sicily and southern Italy, and then the Mediterranean Jewish communities from Egypt are very active in Sicily and North Africa, that kind of what's referred to as a trade triangle. So we've got a lot going on in Sicily.
Yeah, and so when we get to the 11th century and we have kind of this influx of Latin Christian Normans, kind of as you said, and they slowly take over the island and talk, kind of unite across kind of southern Italy and stuff like that. Like, does that seem to change these dynamics very significantly, or is this like a new phase in kind of Sicilian history, or is it very similarly kind of like as we were talking about the kind of long currents just kind of gently changing?
I think it's a pretty important change. I think the 11th century is the start of some pretty big changes in the Mediterranean because the Normans come and they are intentional about what they want to do with Sicily.
Okay.
They appear to want to create a Mediterranean empire. They go east, right? They go to the kind of Balkans, the Byzantine territory. There's some debate about whether some of these Norman kings even maybe want to take over Constantinople. Maybe they want to take over the imperial throne. As you know, many of these southern Italian Normans become very instrumental in the Crusades. They also do some kind of temporarily held conquests in Africa. So it appears that they are looking to kind of actually use Sicily as a kind of jumping off point for a broader empire or something. It doesn't work. The Norman period is very relatively brief, right? It's over by the first part of the 13th century, but it's kind of held up as almost the summation of medieval Sicilian history. In part, it is because those things their buildings, right? Their art does remain. And so people who go to Sicily see some of these Norman buildings, the mosaics that look very different than anything else that's taking place, at least in the Latin world. It looks a lot like something that would show up in the Byzantine world, something that might show up in Istanbul. And that's intentional, right? And these Normans are often praised for what looks like to maybe modernize as toleration or tolerance of the multiple people who live on their island. I take a very different approach. I don't think toleration is really their goal. I don't think it's a virtue for medieval people. I think that for the Normans, appearing to be the kings of a multilingual population and appearing to accept the Muslim courtiers. They have a lot of Muslims in their court. They reportedly keep something that looks like a harem, right? Women in their court, as well as soldiers, right? Tailors, all kinds of stuff. I think that is very different than what we would think of as liking Muslims or accepting their religious faith. You can accept the administrative styles, you can accept the language of administration or the language of art and decoration without actually accepting that there are these people who believe something different than me, and that's okay. So it gives us, again, this opportunity to kind of think about these real complex tensions of a place that looks really different than, say, France at the same time, where we've got Muslims, Jews, we've got Lombards, Greek Christians, we've got all kinds of different people living in this place, and that looks exciting. And it looks like toleration or it looks like multiculturalism. But I think that the truth is that the Normans are trying to do something very different than what we might want in our modern liberal society to think of as a multicultural society.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there's a tendency perhaps for maybe more casual observers to see kind of the fact that there are Muslims and Christians of a variety of different traditions and Jews and, kind of living together together, like literally living in the same space. Some of them from minority religions kind of rising to high ranks, like as you said, kind of at court, and say like, oh, it's just like us. Like a modern kind of a multidisciplinary community. But it's not, because like there's a tension there because it's a projection of Norman power, like a certain style of rule, but also kind of a different conception of kind of the relationship between these three communities and kind of what tolerance means. Is that kind of fair? So could you talk just a little bit more about kind of like, so how did that work in practice, right? Like, if people, wanted to know kind of how a Norman court would operate, in which you did have kind of maybe, Muslims and Jews and some Greek-speaking Christians, perhaps there, like, how is that different than today? Just like at a very basic level.
I would say at the most basic level, what I see in the work that went into my first book about Sicily, which was about travelers, people who come to the island and go back to wherever they are, right? In and out. There was a very strong sense among Muslim travelers to Norman Sicily that they like travelers. They like foreign Muslims. They like to keep them at their court. They like to use them as intellectuals or as, an astrologer or a poet or a map maker. They have these folks as part of their kind of broad cultural output, but that's very different than the Muslims who are native to Sicily.
Right? Okay.
So there were these masses, most of the island was populated by, primarily by Muslims by the time the Normans come in, but they are mostly agricultural workers moved over to the west part of the island, away from the Norman court in Palermo, and subjected to the overlords, right, who come in, who are part of the Latin entrance or colonization, right, in migration from Latin Europe. And so they become very subjected people. They don't have the same kinds of freedoms. And so there appears in some of the travel writings about people going to Sicily from the Muslim world this tension that says, they will keep you, right? One guy says, be careful. They'll keep you there, right? They want intellectuals. They want, right? But they won't want you to leave. But that there's, but can also simultaneously identify a number of pressures that the Normans are putting on the Muslim population to try and convert them to Christianity or to fracture the communities. There becomes a travel ban, a communication ban towards the end of the period in which there was Muslim habitation on the island, which ends in the 13th century when Frederick II rounds up all of the rest of the Muslim population and exports them to a colony in the mainland of the peninsula, Lucera.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, so the island is depopulated of its Muslims starting in the 1220s. And Frederick II uses the excuse of the idea that they might be a fifth column, essentially, that they are aiding. And so he's created a travel ban, a communication ban. He says, look, they're still rebelling against my authority. Round them up. Frederick II he speaks Arabic. He's surrounded by people in his court who speak Arabic. So it's this weird tension between like state-sponsored Muslims versus actual people. And then that colony at Lucera is eventually destroyed when Charles of Anjou is given Sicily as his possession later by the popes, who are mad at Frederick II for various reasons, having to do with the Crusades, and not crusading the way they wanted him to. And so the popes give the island, grant the island to Charles of Anjou and say, well, go take it. So he marches down, does destroy that colony at Lucera, and then begins to proceed to take over the island, which leads to a whole lot more changes in the island's history in the later medieval period. It continues to be quite complex and change hands many times.
That's so interesting too, because it reminds me the one time that I was in Sicily a few years ago, is that we were told about all these kind of Norman castles and Norman things that were there, and like they were always talking about Frederick II, which to me, like my early medieval brain is like, oh, you mean like one of the Rogers or like something like that? It's like no, like we're talking like early 13th century and stuff like that. So, but also too, like how Frederick II, if for our listeners too who might not be familiar, like Frederick II, like you said, like spoke Arabic, like had a very good relation with, the Muslim world kind of generally, like even accused, had such a good relation when he went on crusade, like was accused of actually converting to Islam and like being a fifth columnist himself, right? And so that he is taking these actions against the Muslim population of Sicily, while at the same time projecting like this connection with the Muslim world. Like that's such an interesting kind of tension about kind of outsiders and insiders, or kind of Muslim population living in Sicily itself, and then like the guests.
Right.
Since American Medieval is about the past, it seems fitting that our sister show with Multitude Dreaming Against the Machine is about envisioning a realistic and hopeful future. Each week, journalist and astrophysicist Dr. Adam Becker will have an earnest and entertaining conversation with a guest about possible futures, seen through the lenses of history, science, and culture. In a world where tech oligarchs and their power fantasies seem everywhere, Dreaming Against the Machine aims to take back the public conversation about what our world can and should be. New episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm curious, too, about the kind of population generally, because this is something, too, that I think a lot of people assume, is that when the Normans came in, the assumption is like everybody converted, like immediately, right?
Yeah.
And that's just not the case, right? Like, so by the time we get to say the 11th century, or even kind of the middle of the, if you want to push it to the 12th century or something like that, like, do we have any sense of kind of what percentages of the religion's kind of affiliations of the population kind of as a whole was of Sicily?
Yeah, it's a good question about kind of percentage of population, but we certainly have one good eyewitness, Ibn Jubair, who travels to Sicily, across Sicily in the late 12th century, the reign of King William II, or William the Good. And he identifies a huge set of Muslim communities, particularly in the west of the island. And he tells us that they have their own mosques, that they are allowed to participate in what he calls noisy Muslim celebrations in the streets. And he's just flabbergasted by this. He sees that there are pilgrimage sites, like local pilgrimage sites for Muslims. So there seem to be, and he stays at a mosque in the western part of the island and says, they're fasting, right? They're practicing their faith. They're adhering to Islamic law. At the same time, by the time Ibn Jubair leaves the island, he hears a lot of stories that get rid of that kind of rosier perspective. So he sees that there is a pretty significant Muslim population in some of these towns. He's the one who tells us that there's a harem filled with Muslim women. At the same time, he starts to hear stories, and his group, they're heading back home to Granada in the south of Spain. They've been on a very long trip. They've gone to a lot of places. Sicily's kind of the last stop, and it kind of blows his mind a little bit because these people have their mosques, they have their pilgrimage sites, they have their public celebrations that are noisy. And he says, why are they being allowed to do this? At the same time, he reports to his readers that there are pressures being put on these Muslim communities that lead to a family asking if one of the daughters, the oldest daughter of their family, could go back to Spain with him as a wife, because that would be the only way to get her out of this place where the pressures are towards conversion.
Yeah.
So probably that late 12th century is a time when we're going to see the population percentages tip, right?
Yeah.
If we're thinking about the kind of big picture of by the 1220s, Frederick II is starting to round up this population and send them out to Lucera in the mainland, it's a huge decline. It's some massive percentage of that we think the size of that population versus what the population would have been when the Normans first came in. Are they converting? Many of them probably are converting. We also know from North African sources and sources in Egypt and Italy that many Muslim Sicilians moved. They left.
So the out-migration, yeah.
Out-migration until that was stopped, right? So did they leave right away? Some people obviously got trapped. Likewise, the Jews of Egypt, this kind of multi-pointed, multipolar trade connections and familial connections across the Mediterranean, North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily in particular.
Yeah.
Many of them also, they looked at the Norman arrival as a great disaster, that this was, the enemies were coming, is what some of the sources say, right? The enemies are coming. Many of them likewise got as far away as they could. We have sources that let us know that some were trapped on the island after. And so then there becomes this question, particularly vital for legal reasons in sort of Islamic law, about what do you do when there's a community of Muslims, right, living under Christian dominion? Are they accepted as part of the Muslim world? They were supposed to have left, according to Islamic law.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I've written about is this question that one of the jurists in North Africa deals with is, how do we deal with this Muslim population that's essentially been trapped, or they've chosen to live in this Christian space for whatever reason?
Yeah.
And the jurist who deals with this question, we can tell from his name that he is Sicilian, or he is descended from Sicilian population.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a live issue.
So live question for him. Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah. I'm curious too, and I think, I mean, this is something that I think your work, all of your work does so beautifully, and something, that I've written a little bit about as well, or at least David and I did kind of in the Bright Ages, is just kind of emphasize the ability for people to move, and how the idea of a kind of a static Middle Ages, and how Sicily really kind of, as you were talking about, kind of really brings that to life. The thing that we or maybe people sometimes often forget, even if they understand that, is like sometimes that movement is not willful, right? Is that people are being kind of pushed out because of kind of hostile situations that they find themselves in, that, we are not, talking about kind of nice things that are happening, and ideas of tolerance always involves the point of a sword in some way, right? Or at least the threat of a sword in some cases too. Right.
And my little book about migration really kind of highlighted that through biography, this notion that people are moving for a variety of reasons. Seem a lot like many of the reasons people move today, right?
Yeah.
Security, they want to live among co-religionists, they want a better job, they want better financial prospects, or they've been forced out of somewhere because of either political or religious violence or enslavement.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that the Mediterranean in particular can really do to kind of change our larger narrative about the Middle Ages, which I know many, many people are working on this, but the kind of standard narrative is that when Rome, quote, fell, so did a slave economy. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah.
That we see many people literally moved against their will.
Yeah. Yeah, how important the slave economy kind of was throughout the early Middle Ages. And as you said, I mean, there's a lot of kind of research that's been done, especially, in the last 20 years or something like that, maybe even less than that.
Right.
But some really kind of big, really important books about that too. I do want to kind of flip it just for a second, though. I want to ask you about Jews in Sicily for a second. But before we get to there too, is what about the people who stayed? Because we were talking about kind of the people who moved, and that there seemed to have been, Sicily changes hands like several times, right? And then there's kind of new rulers and stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's new rulers and different policies change. As your work kind of highlights, we can't just talk about the Normans aren't themselves, for example, in monolithic kind of thing. But then there seems to be a willingness on the part of, again, not just Muslims, but Jews and also kind of Byzantine Christians, that there was something about Sicily itself that they felt connected enough there, or maybe they couldn't move, but there were probably some people who just didn't want to move because that was their home. Like, do we see that come through at all in the sources, or am I just kind of projecting something onto the past there?
We do. I have, for example, some of the Norman chroniclers talk about when they come into the island, they come up to some communities that are filled with Greek Christians. And the Normans are convinced that they are going to be welcomed as liberators. And they are shocked when they are not welcomed as liberators, that these Greek Christian populations have been living just fine for centuries, obviously continuing to practice their religion. Obviously, they've worked out their relationship with their Muslim rulers of the island. And they don't want this new this new situation, right? Do they stay because it's home, right? Like that's that kind of opposite end of many people are quite mobile. Mobility is much broader than our kind of standard narrative of the Middle Ages. Lots and lots of people traveled both willfully and for fun, right?
Yeah.
Against their will and because they wanted to go somewhere cool, or they wanted to, go on a pilgrimage or whatever it is. At the same time, many people are quite bounded to their homes. And one of the things that we see when we look at the sources for people who migrate, perhaps against their will, is that they're not always able to establish a new life in the way that they would want to,
sure.
Right? In the new place. Maimonides is a really good example of this. He was a learned, probably the most learned Jewish philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages. He lived in Cordoba when it was taken over by a new Muslim regime, which was less welcoming to people who did not adhere to their version of Islam. So like many of the Jews of that city, he fled. He tried many different places, including Jerusalem, which did not work out, ended up living in Egypt and having a very strong career there, but always referred to himself as a Spaniard.
Yeah.
Right? Like that homeland was always still in there, right? And so I think that we see this even with people. I have some sources about Jewish families that are separated, one member in Sicily and other members elsewhere. And in these, we see deep, deep emotion about the idea of being separated from their families and being separated from their homeland. And one of them is a mother who says, I thought my son was dead. I hadn't seen him in so long. I find out he's alive somewhere in Egypt or somewhere. And she writes this letter and says, I want to see you one more time before I die. Can you come back here? Yeah. Deep, deep emotional connection despite these very long distances. And so I think some people feel that about places and other people feel it about the family and the culture. And so it's that kind of push-pull of travel can be really exciting and fun, and we can be really excited about the kind of expansive world that it shows us, at the same time as remembering people loved their families and they loved the land that they'd worked hard to make into a life for themselves.
Yeah, no, that's an astonishing source about the mother writing to their son, and it just there are those moments, right, when you're doing research or you bring that to a classroom or something like that, and just remind yourself that like these were people in the past, right. like in all their kind of messiness, but their emotion, their full, rich, colorful lives that they lived in, which they could understand that they needed to, in what we're talking about, like needed to move, but still long for home and for family and community that they had to leave behind.
Exactly.
And sometimes making very difficult choices to decide to stay or to go. Like it's really, really puts the importance of these things and how, although, of course this happened 1,000 years ago or more, like depending in very different cultural situations, about like the reality of these choices that people are making today too, kind of brings them into sharp focus. I was thinking about this too, because I just finished one of my on Multitude Network, one of our other kind of sister shows is the show Wow If True. One of the hosts of that is Isabel Kim. She has a brand new novel out called Sublimation. It's really excellent. It's a sci-fi novel. Everybody should go buy it. That's my little plug for it. But it's about kind of migration, and she's talking about the protagonist is a person who lives in or grew up in Korea, but then migrated to the United States. And the sci-fi premise is that when you cross a border and kind of in your head that you're not going to return, you literally split into two people. And so part of you can stay and part of you can go, but you kind of live this weird life afterwards in which you can communicate or not communicate, and which one is the real one and which one is the fake one. Like that's kind of the premise of the book. But she also does some really interesting things about projecting that backwards too, like to show like these are questions people have been dealing with for a really long time, and just really kind of humanizes these questions. So
yeah, one of the apparently catchphrases that I use in the classroom is that medieval people were people.
They were indeed.
They were indeed. Yes. I'm always trying to remind my students, these are humans. These are not just words on a page.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is hard sometimes, like even, even I think as a professional who, we do this all the time, like sometimes we can, just kind of, forget that kind of reality. So I want to shift back just to talk about, can you talk a little bit more? Like this is one of the things that I think that we haven't talked about a lot on the show, but it's something that, medievalists oftentimes kind of think about a lot, is kind of the role of Jews in European society, because going back to kind of discussion about classics, like there isn't a period, in which there aren't Jews kind of across the Mediterranean world, certainly in the CE era, but there was a large population in Sicily, or at least a substantial population in Sicily and throughout kind of Italy as well. And then, like, how can we trace that history there too? And maybe this is kind of a basic question, but like, what kind of sources are there? Like, how easy it is to understand kind of the role that they played, both under Muslim rule, under Greek, Byzantine Christian rule, and then under Latin Christian rule as well.
Yeah. We have a remarkable set of sources called the Cairo Geniza.
Okay.
And this was found in the behind the back wall in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo in Fustat. And it was a storehouse for records with Hebrew writing on them. Now, the Jewish legal prescription is to not destroy any text with the name of God on it. But this community appears to have saved everything in Hebrew writing for whatever reason. And that is amazing for us, because what we have found in there are scads of daily life documents that have not been uncovered for communities, Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, in other places. Trousseau lists, merchant letters like the one from the mother to her son. We have documents that are, things from Maimonides, right? Things that Maimonides wrote, theological things, all the way down to like a receipt, right? And so some of these merchant letters are being sent from Egypt or from Tunisia or from Sicily and southern Italy to community members elsewhere. And what it really does is shows daily life things. It shows these emotional connections. It shows some of the dangers and the risks of medieval travel across the Mediterranean. Sure. Some of these letters are about shipwreck. One person says, everything went wrong on this journey and I arrived naked and it was only because everything was destroyed. My clothes were destroyed. My cargo was destroyed. And the only reason I have recovered from this is because I found somebody who owed me a little bit of money. So, right, like, what luck.
Yeah.
And so it's this cache of documents that we would never be able to see the lives and importance of this particular Jewish community. We have to presume that other communities are living very similarly, but we just don't have those records. So Sicily and the Mediterranean are extremely lucky for the discovery of this. There's a huge project called the Princeton Geniza Project to digitize these. And you can look at on the web, right, for the Princeton Geniza lab. And they digitize them and they'll transcribe them. And some of them are fragments, so they're putting them together in ways that are very, very exciting for all kinds of different types of history. Yeah. Because, of course, they're also these Jews are interacting with Muslims, they're interacting with Christians, they're interacting with the authorities. Some of these letters are like, I was smuggling this thing, but the authorities caught me and I had to pay the import tax, or, just kind of all of this various stuff that's giving us this huge picture, this window into Jewish life in the Mediterranean, which is just unparalleled and super exciting and continues to yield exciting insights.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things too that we like to, or maybe medievalists should keep reminding people. Is like there's still new sources out there, like stuff we haven't found, right? Or stuff that hasn't been particularly well analyzed. Maybe not that I don't want to say it's undiscovered, because oftentimes it's sitting in an archive and an archivist knows exactly where it is. But that hasn't been considered kind of within wider context. Or I think kind of what you're saying is that there are troves of sources that are based in a community but can tell us something about other communities that they're connected to, and it takes kind of other scholars to access those sources and start to put those things together, which doesn't always happen. And the fact that we have these documents from the Geniza is really amazing and paints such a rich, vivid picture of kind of Jewish life in the Mediterranean, the medieval Mediterranean.
Absolutely. And it shows, we haven't talked about trade, but it shows the rich variety of things that are being traded around the Mediterranean. The kind of all the way from what we think of as kind of exciting things to mundane stuff that is the real nuts and bolts of a trade economy, like big batches of indigo, right? Which is a dye stuff, gives a window into the textile industry and the textile trade, and gives us an insight into what some of those products are, but also the kind of changing market for things.
Yeah.
Right? Like we'll see in some of these letters things like, well, I took my big load of pepper to Palermo where I had been told that it was selling really well, but by the time I got here, the market was crashed and nobody wanted the pepper, so I had to reload it and take it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so this kind of, hey, look, markets work the way markets work.
They do indeed. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I love reading some of these documents with students in the classroom because I think that they don't recognize the degree to which communication can be that fast, right? Where somebody says, hey, send me a letter. I'm waiting to find out if pepper is selling well, so send me a thing before I get on this boat, right? People can communicate relatively rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that reality, right, of before electronic communication or instantaneous communication is like everything seems to take a million years. I think this is particularly acute for Americans, too, because the country is so freaking big.
Right.
Like, it just is. But, like, Europe is small. Like, it's a wee, tiny little thing. My apologies to Europeans right now for saying that. But yeah, you can move across the Mediterranean relatively quickly. Like, it'll still take you some time, but, like, you can get a message somewhere, too. The other thing too is about trade goods. Like, it made me remember, like, I was having a conversation and just how like I'm kind of learning things too, because I'm I probably more of a kind of a cultural and intellectual historian too. So social history is a little bit kind of, and especially academic history, like I don't think about it in the same way. But also too, there's moments where you butt up against that. When David and I were working on our book Oathbreakers, which is about 9th century Carolingian Civil War, I was talking with a colleague and just saying like, oh, this province in the south of France, like Septimania, like it seems to be really important. Like, what's going on there? And they just looked me dead in the eye and they said salt.
Right.
It's like, that's where the salt mines were. And it's just like, oh, yeah, no, that's really important. Yeah, that's
salt
where you
is
got
so important.
Salt is so important. Yeah.
Right. And so are things like alum, right? Which is like a fixative for the dye. People don't think of that as exciting because it's not gold or silk or incense or spices. If you want to dye your textiles and have that dye remain in the textiles, a dye fixative is super, super important.
Yeah.
Right? So being able to look kind of bottom up at what are some of those economic products that keep the rest of it going.
That's right. And that's what the Mediterranean does, because those things aren't grown or found everywhere else. Like, and you got to move them somehow, and they keep moving, and they keep showing up in all these kind of unexpected places. So that's really amazing.
Exactly.
We are unfortunately kind of running towards the end of our time. This has been really amazing, and I will put on another plug. Just everybody should go visit Sicily. It's really amazing and
very beautiful.
Yeah, very. Do you have a favorite place in Sicily that you like to go?
I mean, I love Palermo. And there are some particular churches in Palermo that have some of the remnants of, like at the top of a column, there will be Arabic words incised. They've clearly reused the spolia and then the mosaics that look like Byzantine mosaics. You could spend your whole time just in Palermo, but the whole island is wonderful. And the food is great. And,
yes, the food is amazing. I remember I loved Palermo. Like, that was probably my favorite trip when we went around there a little bit, especially the monastery of Monreale, kind of up above Palermo. It's just like, again, the mosaics, they're just absolutely stunning. Just the way that they're preserved and still there. So everybody go visit Palermo. So
go visit Palermo, be respectful, don't overrun it, but
no, exactly.
Go.
So, but yeah, regardless, be nicer than the German tourists that are there anyway. So yeah, I'm sure that's almost guaranteed. Sorry. Again, I'm just offending everybody in Europe today on this episode. So it's yeah. Anyway, so Sarah, this has been a really lovely conversation. If people do want to learn kind of more about you or your work, is there any place kind of on the internet you would direct them?
I have a website, Davis-Secord with no hyphen, just all kind of jammed together, .wordpress.com. Kind of a little back in the olden days of websites, but it links to all my books, including one we didn't talk about, which is my foray into the global Middle Ages.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe in the future we'll talk about the global Middle Ages.
We'll have to have you back. That's right. This has been delightful. And as long as we can talk about, because, there was an episode a little while ago where we had a couple of people from the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast on, and one of them happened to be in Germany. And so we just talked about Kuchen, about cake for like 10 minutes. And I think I want this really in my heart to be a food podcast. So we could just do that. We could just talk about
food.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, all right. Thank you again, Sarah. This has been really a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, very fun.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of American Medieval. Hopefully, we'll see you again next week. Until then, take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.